I can tell you now where every single exit of the synagogue I grew up in is. Again, no one told me to do that. There weren't safety trainings for that. It's just something I carry with me. And when I go into spaces where I am gathering with other Jewish people, I make sure I know where the exits are, and it's instinctual, it's immediate. And that's both an anxiety response and a trauma response.
My guests today are Asha M. Seruya and Laur Plawker, the hosts of the Kvetching on the Couch podcast, a podcast about Jewish mental health. Asha is a social worker and psychotherapist specialising in trauma-informed care, weight stigma, and eating disorder recovery. Laur is a suicide prevention specialist who works at the Jed Foundation, a non-profit organisation that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for teenagers and young adults in the United States. In addition to co-hosting their podcast together, both Asha and Laur are wonderful content creators in their own right, posting engaging, visibly appealing, and digestible content on mental health, body positivity, and Jewish identity. Asha can be found on Instagram at Badash Therapy, while Laur can be found at The Healing Happy Cook. Laura and Asha, thank you so much for being here. How are you guys doing?
We're great. That was a wonderful intro.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I don't know that I've ever been introduced so thoroughly. Yeah. It was flattering.
It was.
Awesome. I like to start off things right. I don't want to start with a bad introduction.
No, it was really nice.
Great. So look, as I mentioned before, in the United Kingdom, it is currently Mental Health Awareness Week, where the official theme for this year, as set by the Mental Health Foundation, is anxiety. In what ways can anti-Semitism contribute towards anxiety for Jews? Asha, should we start with you?
Sure. So many ways. Where do we start?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you had sent us some questions ahead of time, and you noted things like intergenerational trauma, rising anti-Semitism, and particular violent attacks against Jewish people and the Jewish community. And, as Laura and I were going through these questions, I remember just thinking to myself sort of like, well, when you see people like you being attacked, you're going to feel anxious about it. You're going to be scared and nervous, because how could you not be?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Laur, what about you?
Yeah, I guess I think that the way that we currently engage with and understand anti-Semitism is so different, right? It's a 3,000-year-old hatred, right? And we experience so much of it now via social media and the internet. And that means that whether or not you are experiencing anti-Semitism when you walk down the street, you are constantly exposed to anti-Semitism. So I think with that being true, it's important to just give yourself some grace in experiencing feelings of anxiety as it pertains to anti-Semitism, that it's everywhere, it's pervasive, it's in the palms of our hands, in our phones. It's a part of online rhetoric and discourse. It's in the news, and go.
I was just going to say, it's even in communities where you might think you would be safe, right?
Absolutely.
I don't know about, the larger audience you have here, but I know Laura and I both identify as more progressive leaning. And, you would think that in progressive spaces where people theoretically are more welcoming, more open, and really try to focus on supporting marginalized groups, you would think that Jews would be included in that. And yet a lot of times they're not. And in fact, we are the villains in the story. And that's really complicated when, maybe the one space that you thought could be welcoming to you isn't even welcoming to you. So where can you go? And that's extremely anxiety inducing.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine it is. You also mentioned social media. So I mean, breaking it down, if there is a Jewish person just scrolling Instagram as one might, and they come across a piece of anti-Semitic content, what what might that do to that person? Now, obviously, everyone's different, but what might someone who might could be prone to anxiety experience
Yeah.
in that moment?
Yeah.
Sure.
There's a lot of physiological symptoms of anxiety. I know, I mean, everyone's different. Laura, you could certainly like share your
Hmm.
personal anxiety responses. Mine are getting very warm, like flushed cheeks, that just like really intense panic in your chest. It's a lot of somatic experiences, I think. And sure, there are also like probably racing thoughts. But a lot of it, at least for me, is pretty somatic. What about you, Laura?
Yeah, I also experience anxiety somatically. I feel a heaviness that
Mm,
it often feels like a fatigue overcomes
yeah,
me, and it quite literally feels like a physical weight in my bones that seeps over me, and often it leads to the feeling of paralysis, not necessarily in a literal sense, but that I can't. I don't know what to do next. I don't know the move. Sometimes my racing thoughts are going so fast that that leads to paralysis. And I find myself very still in a way that I find very uncomfortable.
mm.
Um, and
Frozen,
yeah,
right?
frozen
I mean,
in
something
fear
to
and anxiety. Hmm.
yeah, something to remember is when we think about traumatic incidents or just even perceived danger, the body goes into fight, flight, or freeze. There's also fawn. There's a couple of different
Hmm.
trauma responses that we engage in, and what Laura's kind of pointing to is that freeze response of just like I don't know what to do. I'm frozen. I cannot do anything. I don't know how to help myself, and that's it's a really difficult place to be in.
Sure. And I also just wanted to add that, like, I think, to your point, Ellie, about how you could just be scrolling on social media, right? And see something, and you said an anti Semitic post. What I would add is that it doesn't even have to be that some of the
Mhm.
ways, like, I've posted a picture of a challah that I made, right? And it's just a picture of a challah, and a lot of people like challah that aren't Jewish. It's become a very popular bread in a lot of different parts of the world. And in the comments, I'll get something hateful from people who know it's a Jewish bread. So it really doesn't need to be that it's an anti Semitic post with anti Semitic content. So often it just catches you fully by surprise. And how anxiety inducing is that, right? You might have been looking at a challah braiding video, being like,
Right.
oh, I'm so excited to try this out. That looks like something I can do. And that's a form of Jewish joy. And then in the comments, you might see, I wish you were dead. And that's a horrible experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also pretty horrible because the difference there is that it's your post and your Instagram or your social media is your space. So when someone comes into your space and says something like that, that's pretty horrible, right?
Yeah, it's like someone coming into your home and shouting at you and telling you you're a terrible person and you need to leave. Like,
Yeah.
you
You know, it struck me, Laura, as you were describing the freeze response. It kind of evokes a feeling of helplessness, which I think a lot of
Hmm.
Jews feel when presented with anti-Semitism. There is a feeling of helplessness, not being able to do anything, and the similarities between that and anxiety, at least to me, seem quite similar. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, helplessness, I mean, certainly is a very broad experience, but yes, I think many of us would connect anxiety with a feeling of helplessness, also a feeling of overwhelm, which often is associated with helplessness as well. So yeah, I think all of these things are very interconnected.
Asha, you mentioned intergenerational trauma. Could you kind of explain what this term means and how it might relate to Jewish people?
Yeah, absolutely. So, intergenerational trauma, it's basically what it sounds like. Trauma is passed down physiologically and psychologically from each generation. And for Jewish people, this can look a lot of different ways, just like with many other people who are parts of communities that have also been systematically and historically marginalized. and traumatized, including mental health issues like anxiety, like we're talking about here, which also extends to OCD, nightmares about things you've never personally experienced. That's actually one that there's a lot of evidence for. A lot of, I should note, a lot of the intergenerational trauma research is actually focused on Holocaust survivors and on the children of Holocaust survivors. We are in no way, shape, or form the only community that experiences it, but a lot of the research comes from that. So we do actually have a lot of research that suggests that children of Holocaust survivors and also of not of Holocaust survivors actually have a lot of nightmares about fires. It's just a very common trope within nightmares for Jewish people. Statistically, it's an interesting piece of intergenerational trauma. And there's also, perceived food scarcity. So, for example, the Jewish community, we have experienced food scarcity throughout our run as a cultural group, I guess we could say. And so, even when we may not have literal food scarcity in our present, we can still feel perceived food scarcity because of the genetic aspects of trauma and how that can sort of live within you, even if it's not your personal lived experience.
Yeah. I'd add to that also. I'm a third generation Shoah survivor. My grandma is a remarkable woman who was a hidden child in the Holocaust. Her story starts in Belgium, in Brussels. And it's interesting because one of the ways that I've experienced intergenerational trauma that I didn't know was that until much, much later, right? My sister and I, only a few years ago, we were just discussing some experiences we had had in childhood. And something we both came to the frankly horrific realization of is that we had both identified hiding spaces in our childhood homes in case the Nazis came. No one told us to do that. Our parents certainly hadn't told us to do that. Our grandmother had never had that conversation with us. We just independently of one another had identified those spaces. I can tell you now where every single exit of the synagogue I grew up in is. Again, no one told me to do that. There weren't safety trainings for that. It's just something I carry with me. And when I go into spaces where I am gathering with other Jewish people, I make sure I know where the exits are, and it's instinctual, it's immediate. And that's both an anxiety response and a trauma response. So, I'm sharing a piece of me and a piece of my experience. But I don't think that's isolated to being my own experience. I think a lot of people, a lot of Jewish people have similar experiences.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. I just from talking to Jewish people, it's sort of it becomes clear that these experiences are not unique, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. Have either of you ever personally been in the position of having to assist someone suffering from anxiety or other mental health issues due to anti-Semitism? Laur, should we start with you?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. In my previous role as a mental health specialist and suicide prevention consultants for high schools, the primary part of my job was to look at all facets of what is impacting student mental health. So in my case, students ages about 13 to 18 across the United States, right? Not specifically Jewish students, just students in the US. And for many of the schools I worked with, anti-Semitism arose as a mitigating factor for student mental health. So given that it was my job to build out systems that addressed student mental health, that couldn't be happening. That work cannot happen without addressing systemic prejudice, bias, racism, all of the isms, right, that arise within the work, anti-Semitism being one of those. So for me, it was frankly a very personal challenge. It was hard not to get too deep personally and create too much of a focus on any one thing, because I was tasked, right, with building this holistic approach to student mental health. But I mean, how could I not? How could I have such a task and hear, students say this has been an issue for a long time and it's not being dealt with, and then turn around and do nothing with that. So, I found my ways. I found ways to incorporate anti-bias trainings that were run by Jewish organizations or Jewish people, and make specific recommendations to those schools to support them in the work, but also, and more importantly, in the moment, just to make sure that those students knew that they were heard, finally heard by someone who wasn't just going to dismiss it and brush it away. And I think that that's so important. Is I am so used, there's the term gaslighting, right? That I'm so used to being gaslit as a Jewish person. And I think so many people are basically having it waved away, told that you're crazy. This isn't an experience that is for you. You have so much privilege. You have all the privilege. Um, you are as well off as you can be as a group of people. And I'm so used to hearing that. And so many people are used to hearing that when you are tasked with supporting someone who is struggling with their mental health due to anti-Semitism, it's important to know that that's a starting place, that so many of us have had it reinforced for so long and so consistently that we are not the victim, that we are the problem. So, it's for folks who have internalized that, especially our young people, that is a really formative and damaging experience that you can't just treat the symptoms of mental health, right? Issues. You need to work towards the cause, towards understanding the cause. And unfortunately, so much of that is the messaging that we are hearing and that young people are exposed to in a really major way right now.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When you do see young people internalizing this anti-Semitism, how might that be expressed? How might they then act?
It's a really good question. I think it manifests differently for everyone. I think the key word with internalized anti-Semitism is internalized, right? And because we're all different, we all will have a different approach and different understanding or manifestation of what that can look like. I've seen internalized anti-Semitism look like everything from trying to, I don't know that people would say that they're doing this, but trying to like apologize through their own actions. Trying to prove something, that they're a good Jew, a better Jew. And for those who are listening to this via audio, I'm doing a lot of air quotes with my fingers. But the reason I say that is because so often this looks like a condemnation of a relationship to Israel, a condemnation of specific practices or Orthodox communities, right? A lot of what internalized anti-Semitism can manifest of is a separation of Jewish people whom you have identified as the problems, the root of the problem within your community, and trying to create as much distance between yourself and them as possible. And this can lead to a fundamental lack of understanding about communities that are more insular, like from communities. And if you've never been to Israel, it's very easy to completely distance yourself emotionally from Israel. I certainly did as a young person before I went and learned. So, yeah, I think it can look a lot like having a chip on your shoulder and having something to prove and being very loud about what you won't stand for in one way or another, which is not to say that having principles is a bad thing. And if you love something, I think that you should criticize it and want to make it better. But I think that only condemnation is not criticism. And I think that that's, something very important.
Yep. Yeah, most certainly. Now, looking at anti-Semitism today, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, to look in the news and see physical assaults against Jewish people. When we see violent anti-Semitic attacks occurring today, whether it be in the United States, the United Kingdom, or anywhere, what effects can that have on the mental health of Jewish people, both on the victims and their family members, but also on Jews as a collective? Asha?
Yeah, I mean, what effect doesn't it have? It's a lot of feeling unsafe, a lot of feeling distrustful of other communities. I think it can create. I mean, it can create a lot of problematic behaviors as well, like prejudice against other groups who they feel are targeting the Jews more explicitly or more consistently. Um, as well as some of the other mental health things that we've spoken about. PTSD, absolutely. Even complex trauma, which are slightly different but similar. The when we see people like us being attacked and hurt for being like us, right? It would be different if they were being attacked for other reasons. Not that that makes it okay, but it wouldn't be as close to home, right? We can't apply it to ourselves as much. um, so yeah, it's a lot of negative mental health repercussions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to take the conversation, back to a place that we've been, but I think that another impact would be the ways that we engage with social media as well. Um, that I mean, so many of us learn from these attacks that you've mentioned through social media, as major media outlets are not covering them. And social media has, I think it can and has truly desensitized a lot of people to horrific acts of violence. Um, a lot of the attacks that you've mentioned happen to people who are visibly Jewish, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, and a lot of the time that correlates with Orthodox or from communities, people who are wearing tzitzit or yarmulkes, kippot, anything that may identify them as Jewish. That's what I mean when I say visibly Jewish. And I think to the point of what I said earlier, I think when you have some distance from communities, from Orthodox communities, right, or people who are visibly Jewish, I think that desensitization might be stronger. And it's a means of self-preservation for a lot of people. I'm not, I don't want to condemn anybody who is trying to create that distance for themselves, right? Because for so many people, um, why would you want to watch that, right? You might know that it's happening, but why would you want to watch it?
Mm,
And it's the nature of social media that these videos are shared far and wide, um, and anyone can view or comment on them. So you might see that, and then you might also see people in the comments cheering on the attacker, saying that it was deserved, right? Um, and the impact of that is, it's just doubling and tripling down on what is already so damaging to mental health. To watch the video is damaging, to hear of the attack is damaging. For people who have their phones off after for Shabbat, when they turn their phone back on, it is often to an active group text, right, or a WhatsApp group sharing about a threat to their own community, and it's or to another attack that they've seen on social media, and that's an onslaught of information. So it is incredibly damaging to, I think, feel so. It's hard to have a balance between, somehow I think I'm always expecting it, like I'm always dreading to receive that information and knowing that it's going to come, because I understand the realities of what we deal with as a people. And then I'm somehow, it's still like getting hit by a truck every time. and that feeling never goes away. So, there's always the shock factor for me, even though I'm fundamentally unsurprised. So I think that that's a very uncomfortable dichotomy to try. It's, in therapy we'd use the word dialectic. Like, I think that it's a very uncomfortable thing to try and balance. Those are two very different feelings of like, I know this happens, I'm unsurprised, I'm almost desensitized to it, with why does this hurt in the very deepest parts of my soul if I am, as I say, desensitized, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a heavy thing to walk around with, and I don't think a lot of people know just how many Jewish people are walking around with that feeling. Now, we've spoken quite a bit about social media. Let's talk a bit about traditional media. There is an often used trope in films and television about Jews being neurotic and displaying symptoms of what appears to be anxiety. We've all seen the nebbish, worrisome Jewish person fretting over something, usually inconsequential in some film or TV show. Where do you think this trope comes from, and to what extent is there some truth to it, Asha?
Yeah, I mean, I think like all tropes and stereotypes, right? There's always a tiny little grain of sand of truth, right? Um, and I think for our particular community and this particular stereotype, it's very much rooted in truth because as we sort of began the episode discussing, we are deeply impacted by intergenerational trauma. And so our our community is highly anxious. Our community is highly paranoid. And if we're not born with brains to be predisposed that way, we are still then taught to be that way by our education, like our specific Jewish community education. We're taught to always be on guard that something else could happen. So inevitably, when you teach your children to always be on guard and to view everything as a threat or as a potential threat, you're going to walk around the world pretty anxious, and other people are going to find that a little bit odd because they don't have the lived experience or the communal experience that you have. Although I think, yes, it's rooted in truth, the way that we talk about it as a collective, not as a Jewish collective, but as like, in the world and in the media, it's very much a joke. It's played for laughs. It's acted as if it's not a big deal and we're being silly. And that, I think, is more the issue than the trope itself, because it does need to be taken seriously because it's rooted in something very real and we need support for that.
I would also like to hear both of your thoughts on the behavior of seemingly erratic anti-Semites. We've spoken about mental health among Jewish people. I want to turn the conversation to mental health among anti-Semites. Let us take a notable example. Let's take Kanye West, for example, whose recent anti-Semitic tirades were explained away by a fair amount of people as being down to poor mental health. Now, for our listeners who don't know, Kanye West, or Ye as he prefers to be known, went on an anti-Semitic rampage late last year, saying he wanted to go, quote, DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, denying the Holocaust, readily admitting that he was anti-Semitic, praising Hitler, and so on and so on. This went on for a few weeks. All his partners and brands then dropped him, and neo-Nazis have since referenced him in some of their activities, holding him up as some sort of role model. He is also known to have been suffering from mental health issues for some time, with some of his close associates in the past suggesting that he was refusing or failing to take appropriate medication. What is the relationship between mental health and anti-Semitism, and could this apply to any form of extreme or erratic behavior?
Yeah, I actually think Asher speaks on this really beautifully, so I'm going to let them do that.
Thank you. It's complicated. It's very much a both and situation, at least in my view. When people have breaks with reality, they will often start spouting rhetoric from various cultural groups, usually the ones with the most extreme views. And so these can range from anti-Semitism to racism to all kinds of isms, homophobia, right? And if we didn't live in a world that had all these isms, there wouldn't be something to latch onto in the first place, right? So yes, those with mental illnesses often, or not those with mental illnesses, those who have breaks from reality, because there are many different kinds of mental illnesses, and
Mm-hmm.
that's also important to mention. But those who have breaks with reality will often go to very like baser instincts kind of functioning. And one of our baser instincts is fear. And so I think that is a lot of where it kind of blooms from, if that makes sense. And again, if we didn't fear Black people, Jews, gay people, we wouldn't then spout that kind of rhetoric, right? So it's complicated in the sense that it wouldn't exist if we didn't already live in a world that feels this way. And when you have breaks with reality, there is a tendency to hone in on a scapegoat, and to really reinforce paranoid types of thinking. And, you know, anti-Semitism in and of itself really fits into that very well if we think about how anti-Semitism operates as like a conspiracy theory. When you have a paranoid delusion, that becomes very attractive, right? But again, it's not that mental health is a reason to be anti-Semitic. It's that we live in an anti-Semitic world, and when your mind becomes fragile in that way, it can very quickly attach onto social ideas that we know are not in any way, shape, or form accurate.
Sure. And I'll add to that just anti-Semitism and any kind of cultural hatred isn't a symptom of mental illness in and of itself. It's a manifestation, to Asher's point, of cultural fears in someone's mind that's lost its grip on reality. So hateful ideology can and might be expressed within this, but they're not one and the same. And mental illness cannot be an excuse for anti-Semitic rhetoric. So there are many people who are deeply mentally ill who do not harm others and do not believe hateful things about others, and who statistically are more likely to harm themselves than others.
Well, that really leads me on to this question, which is when someone says or does something anti-Semitic, and that is waved away by saying no, they are suffering from poor mental health. What does that then do to other people who are also suffering from that mental health issue?
Yeah, I mean, it demonizes them. It adds a layer of misunderstanding around how paranoid delusions develop, how psychosis functions. It's not as if we live in a world without mental health stigma, but it continues to pile on the stigma when we assume that that mental illness is sort of a path to anti-Semitism and therefore understandable.
Now, I want to ask you. If someone is experiencing anxiety or indeed any mental health issue due to anti-Semitism, what are some steps that they could take? Laur?
Yeah. I mean, I think a term that gets thrown around a lot is self-care. And I say it gets thrown around a lot in that I think it is often oversimplified and misused. I think that we've come to equate self-care with, for women, this messaging often looks like bubble baths and manicures. And while those are certainly things you can do as a means of self-care, I think that when there is a specific connection between the form of self-care you're using and the reason, right, for wanting to engage with it, if there's even a reason, you can just regularly engage in self-care practices. But if you are doing this in response to an instance of anti-Semitism or anxiety that is related to anti-Semitism, for me, something that has really helped me is just Jewish joy practices, right? Anything that I am doing that is an exhibition of Jewish joy, for me, like challah baking it tops them all. There is something incredibly therapeutic. That is something that I share with my aunt who lives in Israel. And it's tactile. It's a sensory dream. It requires time and patience, and I cannot do something else while I'm doing that. And it is in and of itself an act of resistance, right, against anti-Semitism, that for me to take the time out of my day to bake a challah and then share that with loved ones around a Shabbat table, I am living the life that my grandmother survived so that I could have. So there's something very healing about that, both in the act of actually baking the challah, right? But also in the connection to the stressor that had me do it in the first place.
Asha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, as a therapist who does in some ways specialize within the Jewish community, I talk to a lot of people a lot of the time about experiencing anti-Semitism either directly or observing it. And so we do talk a lot about how you cope with that, just like any stressor. And that can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. Self-care and coping have to be individualized for them to be effective. The ones that I think Laura mentioned are great. I think too, anything that is sensory in nature, like Laura was saying, movement, even very gentle movement, just stretching, can be a really lovely way to release emotion. Journaling can also be a great one. I also think that in particular in situations where your anxiety is the product of an ism, a bias, going to your community or to other people, maybe not in your community, but who understand and accept you for that part of you is really important, because I think we mentioned it earlier in the episode, but when we experience these kinds of things, it can feel very isolating. And so having the physical proof or even metaphorical proof, if perhaps they're online friends, that you're not alone and that there are people around you who understand, who affirm, can really counteract that very alone, isolated feeling that can make us feel very hopeless and stuck.
Absolutely. And just having the opportunity to speak about it, right? To speak it into existence, right? Rather than have it swirl around in your head. I think that's one of the reasons why the creation of our podcast, Asher, was so cathartic for me. So much of what we have spoken about has swirled around in my head for so long, right? And having the opportunity to just talk about it. And, I think that was incredibly healing. So I definitely echo that emphasis on community. For me, that actually looked like going and finding, I identify as a queer person and a member of the LGBTQ community. And I found an LGBTQ synagogue that has been just the greatest, most beautiful experience of my life. Oh my gosh, you should have all heard the voice note. The voice note that I sent to Asher the first time I left something. I was like, I've done it. I found it. I finally have Jewish community. Because that's been something I've been questing for a very long time, is a place where all parts of me are welcome, accepted, valued, and loved. And I I cannot stress enough the importance of community, and also the importance of giving yourself grace and space if you don't feel like you can engage with community in a given moment. That one of the things like I love about challah baking is it is inherently by myself, right? And sometimes I need the quiet. And sometimes I don't want to talk about it. And that's okay too, as long as we are not avoiding talking about it. It's something that avoiding talking about it in the sense of like, not to meet your own need, but because you don't think you'll be heard. So as long as you are listening to and responding to your own needs, I don't think that there's any wrong way or any right way to meet yourself where you're at as it pertains to kind of giving yourself some healing space for coping.
Yeah. And to that, I will say the reason I made a face, Laura, is because I include avoidance in my coping skills toolkit. Like when I work with clients, right? It's about over reliance. And also I think the caveat you made, Laura, in terms of like the why you're avoiding is helpful too, and definitely a part of it. But also like, yeah, sometimes you're avoiding it because you don't want to deal with it. And that's okay. We can't live there always, because eventually
can't be there forever.
can't be there forever because, and eventually that stuff will come out, and it'll come out in ways that you really don't like, that you don't have a lot of control over, and that maybe make you feel embarrassed or ashamed, right? So we can't live in avoidance and distraction, but we certainly can utilize it.
Right. You can engage with it for sure. In my own work with students, when a student leaves the classroom, just up and leaves unannounced, it's called eloping. And right. Asher made a face, which is what I'm laughing at, because we think of elopement with like weddings, right? And that we run off to marry the person that we love. But eloping from the classroom is very much a thing, and it is what many students will choose when they are in distress, right? And the reason I bring this up is because, eloping is a behavior, right? Avoidance can be a behavior. It's looking at the function of the behavior, the why, that's most important. And when you know the why, you can work on healing and coping and supporting that why. But yeah, needing time to yourself is as important, if that's what is your calling and what works for you, it's as important as surrounding yourself with community.
Yeah, both for sure.
I love the balance and the freedom to be able to sort of do what's right for you. You mentioned your podcast. I'm very glad you did. I want to ask, how would you, for those who haven't listened, how would you describe the Kvetching on the Couch podcast, and who are the sorts of people that you think might be interested in it?
Oh, I'll let Asher start because it's their baby and I'm a loving co-parent.
Yeah, so I did technically birth the podcast. Basically, I wanted to talk about Jewish mental health as a Jewish person experiencing a lot of direct and indirect anti-Semitism. In particular, this happened, I think it was May of, 22?
21.
21? I can't keep track. Yeah, okay, so May of 21, there was a particular upswing on social media in terms of rhetoric. I'm sure many listening remember. And it became clear to me that there was a communal need for, in particular, progressive-minded people who did not want to outright reject a relationship with Israel, to talk about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be in progressive spaces and be Jewish, what it means to be an American Jew versus a non-American Jew, what it means to be a white passing Jew versus not a white passing Jew, just all these, a queer Jew versus not, right? All these intersections that really, secular versus religious, right? That are complicated, but at the end of the day, the thing we have in common is that we're Jewish, and that is a part of who we are, and that is always going to be a part of who we are and how we navigate the world. So I saw a need. And I think I needed it myself. I think I needed to vent, and not many places felt appropriate aside from like my own therapy. And eventually I think between connecting with other people, and talking to other people about what I thought would be helpful, it sort of started coming together that maybe a podcast just talking about our experiences could be helpful to people, because in a lot of ways we don't have conversations in like specifically about Jewish mental health. That's not something, despite the fact that we have many therapists within the Jewish community, and Freud himself, the father of psychoanalysis, was Jewish. We don't actually talk about mental health within the Jewish community that much. And yet we have very specific challenges because of our backgrounds and our specific community experiences. So I really wanted to create a space for that. And then Laura and I connected, and we have a lot in common, and we have a very similar perspective. And she thankfully was willing and ready to hop onto it with me, because I certainly couldn't do it by myself. And and she lit a fire under my ass, and
all I did was believe in the vision.
That's a big deal. So yeah, and we just started talking, and because I think for me, one of the things I kept coming back to is we don't even know how to talk about this yet. We do not have the language for this, and the only way we figure it out is by having conversations. and if I don't do it, who's gonna do it? Like, and not as if it's on me and like I'm some special whoever, but like, who's gonna do it? If I want to do it, I'm gonna do it. So that's how it came about. And I would say that the listeners, overwhelmingly, it's been very positive. I mean, I can't even think of any negative feedback we've really gotten, although we deserve it on the audio front.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I have a new microphone in front of me because we're beginning preparations for our next season. And we were like, we can't record in our AirPods anymore because people are listening and that means they can't hear us.
Yeah. So definitely working on that. But yeah, it's been very positive. And I would say the listeners, for the most part, are people like us, people with our similar values, people with our similar perspectives and similar desires to have these conversations about mental health with people who feel aligned with us and aligned with our Jewishness.
Absolutely. I also think the people who listen to the podcast are looking for the same thing that we were looking for in creating it, which I think is a sense of safety. Asher mentioned earlier that it can be very, very challenging to exist as a progressive Jewish person in the US because you want to be involved and aligned with, right, all these different causes and movements. And for so many of those things, they're things you believe in at your core and you're willing to fight for, and be an informed and supportive ally to other marginalized groups or put yourself behind causes. And you may also be labeled as the oppressor or the villain if your identity becomes known. And there's a real frustrating lack of safety in that. So I think something that was a priority to me in getting on board with Asher's vision and helping bring this project to life was really about trying to provide that sense of safety for others in the way that we have our conversations, in the guests that we bring on, just making sure that there is space for people to feel heard, ask questions, give us feedback. That's something we did a lot, was like ask for feedback in our own social media stories from people who were listening to the podcast and made adjustments accordingly. And we want this to be a collaborative effort. We've had, I think so often, like the who you bring on, right? It matters. It matters. There's the piece of it where it's like you want reach, right? You want somebody with thousands and thousands of followers. But to us, it's always been more important about, do we appreciate the way they deliver information, have conversations, and feel like they'll engage with us authentically? And I think that the response to that has been really wonderful. Like, we've had people on the podcast who have anywhere from like 2,000 followers to people who have, tens of thousands of followers. And I think that in an age where followers are currency, we often lose sight of like who should be having these conversations.
Let me ask you both. What has the podcast done for you personally? Asha, should we start with you?
Sure. Well, on its base, on the non-emotional side of things, I guess, what it has done for me is I guess proven that I can do something like this, which is kind of nice because I don't always feel very confident in myself in that. In terms of more, emotional, personal stuff, I think it's just given me space. One of the things that Laura and I found, and you could certainly speak to this, Laura, if you wish, but one of the things Laura and I would chuckle about a lot is how it would feel to listen to the Kvetching on the Couch theme song jingle as we would like enter the recording. And most of the time we would both get on the phone about 15 minutes beforehand and be like, oh my God, it's been such a rough day. Like, oh my God, I'm so tired. Like, oh my God, why did we decide to do this? Like, this is terrible. And we'd get on and we'd hear the jingle and be like, okay, I'm ready. I'm so ready.
No, it's healing. It really is. It's incredible.
Yeah. So I think that boost of just energy and purpose not again that like we're doing something, insanely unique or what's the word I'm looking for? I guess insanely unique. But for me, I think it helped remind me that it's not just Laura and I who feel this way, first of all. And yeah, I think it did for me what the point is for the podcast for everybody, or for those who listen, which is to feel comfortable in your varying intersectional identities and to feel like you can bring your whole self to a space and that not be rejected.
Absolutely. I think my experience is pretty similar. I think I am someone who struggles a lot with imposter syndrome. I will count myself out long before somebody else counts me out. And I think that a lot of people deal with this. I think women historically are conditioned to experience this. And for me, what was unbelievably and just undeniably true after our first episode recording, which was The Jews Are Tired, was our first episode.
Yeah.
The Jews Are Tired. And that was a responsive episode to the uptick in anti-Semitic hatred and vitriol that was being spewed online in the time period that Asher mentioned earlier, May 2021. And we decided to have this episode, and I didn't know how it was going to go. At the time, we recorded the entirety of the first season live. And I came away from that first episode just absolutely shocked at the ability that I had to say things and to back my words up with knowledge. And as time went on, I realized that I was qualified to do this. And it's something that, Asher saw it in me before I saw it in myself, in asking me to, be their partner in this. But like, um, I didn't believe it. I needed what qualified me to be having these
I
conversations,
remember
much,
this.
much less, right, much less to be leading these conversations, to the point where when Asher first asked me, I was like, why? Why, would you, well, I'm not a Jewish thought leader. I'm not, a mental health clinician. I'm a person. And, I've become a leader in some conversational spaces because of this. I mean, the podcast, honestly, shortly after the creation of the podcast, Asher and I were invited to participate in a conference in Israel. And we were brought out to do exactly that, on having conversations about anti-Semitism in an effective and productive way online. And, it made me realize that I could be a part of these spaces. The door was open to me if I chose to walk through it. And since then I have, and it's been an absolutely incredible evolution for me. And we've taken a lot of time. I think one of the things that I really, really value and that this podcast has done for me is making me realize the value of my own work, time, and space. Because Asher and I have not recorded an episode in a very long time. We're taking a much needed break from producing season 1 to producing season 2. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But it was the realization that I could engage in these spaces while also taking care of myself, as long as I had a community and partner who was willing to do that with me and willing to prioritize that with me. And I do have that in Asher. So it's been an incredibly formative experience for me. I really do. I wouldn't change a single thing about it. I know, we're both getting
Asher's
emotional with
face.
each other. I know.
Oh my god, that's really, really lovely to hear. I think it's a really good and interesting podcast. I think the energy between you two is really nice, and you make often difficult subjects really not difficult to listen to, really palatable, and you want to keep listening, even though, talking about mental health issue and symptoms, it's like, oh my god, this is quite a bit much.
Heavy,
But
yeah.
no,
Thank
it's
you.
yeah, no, absolutely. Now, let me ask you both a question that I ask all of our guests. If someone who is not Jewish approaches you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start? Asha, let's begin with you.
Yes. I think for me, Laura and I talked about this before, so I'm gonna let you have your one. I'm gonna say, talk to Jews. Talk to
Mm-hmm.
lots of Jews from lots of different backgrounds. We, like all minority communities, are not a monolith, and you need to take in the depth and breadth of the experience of being Jewish in many different places and in many different cultures, I think, to fully understand the breadth and depth of anti-Semitism. And so I think, yeah, being in community with Jewish people is essential for fighting anti-Semitism as a non-Jew.
Absolutely. And I'd even add to that, I mean, absolutely everything Asher said. But I think I'd also add that it's really important, in addition to engaging with Jewish sources and Jewish educators and Jewish people, be sure to examine sources and propaganda from non Jews throughout history as well, as painful as doing so might be, or as surprising as it might be. I've just found that I engage in discourse most meaningfully and intentionally when I understand what rhetoric my oppressors have been consuming, and what the conversation has been throughout history. Making sure in order to really know that, you have to be reading everything, and you have to be having all of those conversations. So many people consume information and misinformation either willfully or ignorantly, right? So in order to even understand what might be misinformation, you have to be willing to step back and take a look at all of it. I'd also just say that it's really important to meet people where they're at in the conversation. um, I think this also just includes yourself. Like, I'm someone who unfortunately believed a lot of misinformation for a long time and really had to fight my way through that, in order to get the much more holistic understanding that I have today. And it's not because I didn't want to be standing up against anti Semitism, it's because I didn't challenge what I had been exposed to. So I think understanding why this is important to you, know your why before engaging in the work, because otherwise it can come off as, whether your intent is good as not or not, it could come off as performative, or you could actually have a harmful impact, even if you think you're doing it for the right reasons. Just make sure you know your why and that you're comfortable with why you want to be a part of the conversation.
Mm. Yeah, really, really good points. Now, before we wrap up, please tell the listeners, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you? Asha, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. So before I do my personal spiel, I did want to say, as Laura mentioned, we have taken a pretty significant break before starting on season 2, and we don't have a start date for that yet. But we do want to announce that we will be having an upcoming special episode. Specifically, we want to talk about existing as Jewish online, which is an episode that we've done in season 1, but we, of course, want to continue that conversation because there is always more to say. And also, I think it ties into why Laura and I have decided to take some of this time. And so we just wanted to provide some information for our listeners who maybe are wondering where in the world we have gone. So, yeah, anything else on that, Laura?
Uh, Nothing other than, I just, our goal in doing that really is to, I think to humanize the content creation experience. I think a bit for our listeners, who may or may not be content creators themselves. So, if they are, hopefully it provides a sense of, community and understanding. And then if they aren't, they might better understand what it looks like and feels like to be online and Jewish in a very public way, and all that that comes with, which, you know, to Asher's point, is very much what we plan to talk about in that special episode. So it's my hope that it creates a sense of like empathy, community, and keeps our listeners patient with us as we move forward into making some very exciting changes and updates for season 2.
Yes. And in terms of my personal stuff, you can find me on my website. It is just my name, ashermseruya.com. Seruya is phonetic, even though it looks complicated. And my Instagram and basically I think all my social media now is Bad Ash Therapy, like badass, but with Ash. And on my Instagram and on my website, you can find my art, which is the other, like, I guess, big thing that I do. I do a lot of illustrated infographics and art, and you can buy digital downloads, prints, and stickers on my website.
And I can be found on Instagram at the Healing Happy Cook. That is currently my only social media channel, but you can find the two of us and our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, really anywhere that podcasts are, as well as the call-in app. You just search Kvetching on the couch. And as Asher alluded to, Asher did the art for our podcast. So make sure you take a little look at the thumbnail because it's very cute and Asher is very talented. But we hope that if you are hearing about us for the first time, as Asher said earlier, please excuse the audio quality of season 1, but please do listen to season 1. We were finding our sea legs, if you will, and just kind of adjusting in real time. But that's a guaranteed change to season 2. But the content, I'm going to go ahead and say it's great. I'm proud of what we've been able to produce and the conversations we've been able to have and open up for folks. So we hope that you will give us a listen if this is new to you.
All right. That's all really exciting, especially the exclusive announcement. It was an exclusive announcement on the podcast. Asher and Laur, thank you both so much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Ellie.